She counted the coins twice before she understood there weren't enough of them, and the second count did not make her cry, because crying was not on the list of things she allowed herself anymore. $16. 18 men to feed by Friday. A Springhouse with a caved roof and a smell like drowned stone. If you're the kind of person who has ever had to make something out of nothing while everyone around you waited to watch you fail, stay with this one to the end. And while you're here, go on and subscribe and drop the name of your town in the comments, because I promise you, there is a woman like this one who lives somewhere near you. And nobody ever wrote her story down until now. Martha Kessler had come to the bar and cross with a single trunk, a black dress that had been let out twice at the seams, and a letter of reference from a hotel kitchen in Abilene that had burned down 11 days after she left it, so there was no one left to confirm a word of it. She was not a small woman. She had learned young that a woman built the way she was built could either apologize for the space she took up, or she could fill that space with usefulness until nobody had the nerve to comment on it, and she had chosen the second path so thoroughly that by the time she was 34, she had almost forgotten there had ever been another option. She had one rule, and she had built it herself, plank by plank, over years of other people's kitchens and other people's children. Never cry where anyone can see it. Never ask for more than the minimum. Always give the credit away to somebody else, because credit taken was credit that could be argued over, and credit given away was safe. Silas Doyle had put up the notice at 3 towns worth of church bulletin boards and 1 feed store, and it had said, in his own blunt hand, wanted, a cook, must be able to feed 18 men and 4 children, and ask no questions. He had not written bride, though everyone in 3 counties called it that anyway, because there was no way for a widower with a ranch that size and a house that empty to bring a woman onto his land without the whole territory deciding it meant something. He had needed a cook. He had needed, if he was honest with himself in the 2 minutes a day, he allowed for honesty someone to stand in the kitchen doorway in the evening, so the house would stop sounding like a held breath. He did not say this to anyone. He was not a man who said the middle part of any sentence that mattered. He would start, "I just," and then stop, every time, as if the rest of the words cost more than he had on him. Martha stepped off the stage into a yard full of men who had clearly been told to look busy and were failing at it. All 18 of them, finding some reason to be near the corral fence when the coach came in, and she took one look at the ranch house, handsome ones, sagging now at the porch line the way a face sags when it has stopped expecting good news, and one look at the Springhouse behind it, roof half fallen into the spring itself, stone walls green with old rot, and she thought, that is where I will make my money, not the wage. They will pay me the other money, the money nobody is thinking about yet. She did not say this out loud either. She had learned that a woman's plans went further when nobody heard them coming. The children came at her in an order that told her everything about the family before a single one of them spoke a full sentence. First, out from the porch shadow, a girl of perhaps 12, with a dish towel already over one shoulder like a soldier's rifle, eyes doing the fast, tired math of an adult, checking the trunk, checking the stranger's shoes, checking whether this one would need managing or would do the managing herself. That was Ruth, and Martha understood inside of 4 seconds that Ruth had been running this house since her mother died and had not been thanked for a single day of it. Behind her, slower, arms crossed like a barricade, a boy of 9 with a jaw set for a fight nobody had started yet. That was Cole, and his anger sat on him like a coat 2 sizes too big, borrowed from someone, waiting to be handed back to its rightful grief. Half hidden behind the porch post, a girl of maybe 6 who did not speak, who watched Martha's hands instead of her face, who was already, Martha would later learn, drawing pictures nobody was allowed to see. That was Ada. And last, carried out reluctant and cross by a ranch hand who clearly wanted no part of infant duty, a baby of perhaps 14 months who was crying the specific, exhausting cry of a child who has been crying so long it has become simply how he breathes. That was Jem, and Martha would come to think of him, in the weeks ahead, as the barometer of the whole house, loud when the house was breaking, quiet when it began, at last, to heal. Silas Doyle came off the porch last, which told her something too. He was a tall man, wide through the shoulder, in the particular way of men who had done real labor their whole lives and not decoration of it, and his face had the kind of stillness that could be mistaken for calm by someone who had never watched grief settle into a person like silt into a riverbed. He looked at her the way a man looks at a bridge he is not sure will hold his weight, and he said, "You're the cook." "I am," she said. "Martha Kessler, 18 men, 4 children. I don't—" He stopped. He always stopped. "I don't have time to explain the house to you proper. Ruth'll show you where things are." "I don't need things," explained Martha said. "I need a fire lit and an hour, and by supper, you'll know whether you made a mistake hiring me." Something in his jaw moved. That was almost in a better lit room, the beginning of a smile. He did not let it finish. He turned and went back to the corral, back to the 18 men who had in fact stopped pretending to be busy and were now openly staring. And Martha picked up her own trunk before anyone could offer, because a woman who carried her own weight was a woman nobody felt entitled to comment on, and walked into the kitchen to begin the only kind of introduction she trusted, the kind made with her hands. By supper, 18 men who had been living on beans burned to the pot and bread hard enough to use as a doorstop sat down to biscuits that came apart in layers, a stew that had somehow found brightness in a larder that offered her almost nothing, and a peach cobbler made from 3 jars of preserves she'd found forgotten and going soft at the back of a shelf nobody had thought to check. Ruth watched her from the doorway the whole time, arms crossed the same way her brothers were, waiting for the moment this stranger would either prove herself an ally or reveal herself as one more grown-up who would disappear the second things got hard. Cole did not eat with any manners at all, shoveling his food like a boy trying to finish before anyone could take it from him. And when Martha set a second biscuit on his plate without a word, without a comment, without making him ask, his jaw unclenched by 1 degree, and that 1 degree was the first thing Martha counted that night as a victory. She found over the following days that the real work of the bar and cross was not the cooking at all, though the cooking was no small thing. 18 men eating 3 times a day was a war fought with flour and fire, and she fought it and won it every single day without complaint, because complaint was not on the list. The real work was the house itself, which had been left, since the death of the first Mrs. Doyle, to run on the fumes of whatever Ruth could manage between her own schooling and her own grief, which nobody had asked her to set aside, but which she had set aside anyway, the way children do when they see a parent breaking and decide silently to be the one who does not break too. Martha did not confront this. She had learned that confronting a child's premature burden only made the child defend it harder, the way a person defends a wound they're proud of, because the alternative is admitting how much it still hurts. Instead, she simply, quietly, began taking pieces of the burden without asking permission, the way she took the credit and gave it away. She started doing the mending before Ruth could get to it, and when Ruth found the basket empty and looked at her with something halfway between relief and suspicion, Martha only said, "I like sewing better than washing, and you like washing better than sewing, so it's not a favor, it's a trade," which was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that let a tired child accept help without owing anyone a debt of gratitude they didn't have the strength to carry. Scoused. It took her 4 days to go out and truly look at the Springhouse, because the kitchen had to come first. But on the 4th evening, with supper cleared and the men gone off to the bunkhouse, she took a lantern and walked the short path down to it and stood in the wet grass looking at what 14 years of neglect and 1 collapsed roof beam had done to what had clearly once been a fine piece of stonework. The spring still ran cold and clean beneath the wreckage. That was the thing nobody else seemed to have noticed, that the water itself was still good, was in fact better than good. cold enough to numb a hand in under a minute even in the mild autumn evening. She had grown up, before the years of other people's kitchens, on a dairy farm in the hill country, and she knew, the way she knew her own hands, exactly what a spring that cold and that clean was worth to a person who understood butter and cheese and the long, patient art of turning milk into money that didn't spoil the way milk did. She said nothing about it to Silas Doyle for 2 more weeks. She had learned, in the houses of other people, that a plan announced too early was a plan other people felt entitled to have opinions about, and she did not yet know whether this man's opinions would help her or bury her. What she learned instead in those 2 weeks was the shape of the trouble sitting just outside the ranch's fence line, because trouble in a small territory does not stay outside a fence line for long. Mrs. Adelaide Purcell, who ran the church charity circle in the nearest town of Concordia with the iron efficiency of a woman who had never once in her life doubted her own righteousness, made it her particular business to drive out to the bar and cross inside of 10 days of Martha's arrival, ostensibly to bring a basket of preserves for the motherless children, and to look Martha over the way a buyer looks over a horse whose soundness she doubts. "You'll forgive my saying so, Mrs. No," Purcell said, standing in the kitchen doorway in a bonnet that had cost more than Martha's whole wardrobe. But a man in Silas Doyle's position ought to have thought harder about who he brought onto this land. There are decent women in Concordia who would have been glad of the position, women whose families are known. "I expect there are," Martha said, not looking up from the dough she was working, because she had learned that meeting cruelty with a still face and busy hands took the wind out of it faster than any retort could. "I'm sure Mr. Bronte Doyle had his reasons for choosing otherwise. I only say it out of concern for the children," Mrs. Purcell went on, in the particular tone of a woman who has never once in her life said a cruel thing without dressing it as concern. "4 little ones, alone with strangers, no family to watch over the arrangement. It isn't proper, is it? People will talk. People generally do," Martha agreed, and set the bread to rise, and said nothing else, and Mrs. Purcell left with her basket of preserves still half full, and a look on her face that told Martha this particular door had not closed, only paused. The second trouble was harder, because it did not announce itself with a bonnet and a basket. It announced itself 3 weeks in, on a gray afternoon, in the shape of a man named Everett Cray, who came riding in on a good horse with a folder of papers under his arm, and the unhurried confidence of a man who has never had to worry about being liked. He was the president of the only bank within 40 miles, and he sat with Silas Doyle at the kitchen table for the better part of an hour, with the door shut, and when he left, Silas Doyle sat alone at that table for another hour after, staring at nothing, his hands flat on the wood like a man bracing against a wind only he could feel. Martha did not ask. Asking was not on the list either, not directly, not the first time. She simply set a cup of coffee at his elbow, said nothing, and went back to her work. And it was Ruth, later that night, curled into the corner of the kitchen bench with her arms around her knees, who told her the shape of it in a whisper. The way children tell you the things adults think they've successfully hidden. "Papa owes the bank," Ruth said, "since before Mama died, since the drought 2 years back when we lost near half the herd. Mr. Cray says if we don't make good by spring, he'll take the land." She said this in the flat, careful voice of a child who has practiced saying a terrible thing so many times in her own head that saying it out loud has stopped feeling real. "Papa doesn't know I heard. Don't tell him I told you." "I won't," Martha said, and meant it, and felt something in her chest go hard and certain the way it used to go, back on the dairy farm, when she watched her own father face down a bad season with nothing but stubbornness and arithmetic. She thought of the Springhouse. She thought of the spring running cold and clean under all that broken stone, doing nothing, worth nothing to anyone, while a banker in a good coat sat at this family's table with a folder full of numbers that could take their whole world away. She did not sleep well that night, and it was not grief keeping her up. It was the particular, electric wakefulness of a woman who has just found the shape of the thing she is going to do next. She went to Silas Doyle 3 mornings later before the men were up, catching him alone at the corral fence in the gray dawn light, and she said, without any softening around it because softening was not a thing she trusted herself to do well, "I want the Springhouse." He turned surprised out of whatever grim arithmetic he'd been doing in his own head. "It's near ruined. The roof's ruined. The stone's sound. The spring's better than sound. It's the best water I've tasted in this territory, and I grew up knowing the difference." She held his gaze, because looking away would have made it sound like she was asking permission for something small, and this was not small. "Give me the Springhouse and what lumber you can spare, and let me buy in a milk cow or 2 on credit against my wages, and I'll turn you a profit in butter and cheese inside. 4 months that'll put a dent in what you owe that bank." Silas Doyle looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look a man gives when he is recalculating everything he thought he understood about a situation. "You know about Cray." "I know some things get told to me that aren't meant to be," she said, "and I know how to keep them where they're put. I also know that a man sitting at his own table with his hands flat like he's holding the whole house down isn't a man with a plan. I've got one. It's not big enough to save the ranch by itself, but it's a start, and starts are worth more than people give them credit for." He was quiet long enough that she thought she'd overstepped, that she'd mistaken herself for something more than the cook, and she felt the old instinct rise in her to take it back, to make herself smaller, to apologize for the space the offer had taken up in the silence. She did not do it. She had promised herself a long time ago that she would not do it, not anymore, not even when it would have been easier. "I don't have money for lumber," Silas said finally. "I didn't ask for money. I asked for what you can spare and for permission." She let a beat pass. "The rest I'll manage. He stopped, the way he always stopped, right at the edge of the sentence that would have cost him something to finish. Then, instead of finishing it, he did something she had not expected. He nodded once, the way a man nods when he has decided to trust a thing he cannot yet fully explain, and said, "Take what lumber's behind the barn. Take Cole with you. If he'll go, boy needs something to do besides be angry at the world." It was, Martha understood, the most he had said to her at one time since she'd arrived, and she understood also that it had cost him something, and she took it the way she took everything now, with a plain thank you and a turned back and hands already moving toward the next task, because gratitude drawn out too long made a proud man feel he'd been made to beg for something, and she would not do that to him. Cole did go with her, sullen and silent for the first hour, hauling stone and lumber with the aggressive energy of a boy working out a fury he had no other outlet for, and Martha let him work it out in silence because she had learned in other people's houses that some children needed to be given a task before they could be given a conversation. It was on the second afternoon, both of them soaked through from hauling stone up out of the spring's edge, that Cole finally said, apropos of nothing, staring hard at the water, "My mother used to come down here before. She said the water tasted like a story with a good ending." Martha did not stop working, because stopping would have made the moment feel enormous, and he would have shut the door on it the way scared things shut doors. "She sounds like she had a way with words." She did. Cole's jaw worked. "Papa doesn't talk about her. Nobody does. It's like if we don't say her name, the hurting will stop, except it doesn't. It just gets quiet and mean instead." He threw a stone harder than the work required. "I'm not supposed to be angry. Ruth says it upsets Papa. So I just—" He stopped in exactly the way his father stopped, and Martha understood in that moment precisely where the boy had learned it, watching a grieving man swallow his own sentences until his son learned to swallow his too. "You can be angry here," Martha said, still not looking at him, keeping her hands on the stone. "The spring won't tell anyone. Neither will I." Cole did not answer, but he worked for the rest of the afternoon, with his jaw looser than she'd yet seen it, and when they walked back up to the house in the blue evening light, he said, quiet, almost accidental, "Thank you for not making me talk about it." "That's the only kind of thanks worth giving," Martha said. "The kind that cost nothing to say, and means everything anyway." And she thought, walking up that path, that she had just watched a boy set down some part of a coat 2 sizes too big, and that it had not been the fixing of him, not yet, but it had been a beginning. And starts were worth more than people gave them credit for. The Springhouse took the better part of 6 weeks to make sound, working in whatever hours the ranch work didn't claim, and Martha did more of it with her own hands than any of the men expected a cook to do, hauling stone, packing new mortar into old joints with a trowel she'd bought on credit from the mercantile against a promise of butter, splitting the new roof shakes herself when none of the hands had a spare hour, until slowly, plank by plank, the ruin became a room again. Cool, dark, dry, the spring channeled clean through a stone trough at its center, exactly the way her father had built one on the dairy farm of her childhood. Water running fast enough to keep the whole small room at a chill that would hold milk sweet and butter firm through the worst heat of a Texas summer. She bought her first 2 milk cows on the strength of a handshake with a rancher 2 counties over who'd known her father's reputation, if not her own, and who was willing to take payment in butter and cheese over the following season rather than coin up front, because he said, looking her over, that a woman who talked about dairy work the way she did clearly wasn't bluffing, and he'd rather have a partner who paid in good butter than a stranger's silver. He'd have to ride 2 days to spend anyway. The first churning in the new Springhouse, Martha stood alone in the cool dark with her arms aching and the paddle going and going, and when the butter finally broke, that moment every dairy woman knows, when the cream stops being cream and becomes, all at once, something else entirely, something with a texture and a worth of its own. She stood there with tears standing unshed in her eyes, because it reminded her, sharp and sudden, of her mother's hands doing this same motion, her mother who had died of a fever the winter Martha turned 19, in a year when there had been no money for a doctor to come in time. And Martha had made a rule that day, the first rule, the foundation rule underneath all the others. She would never again be a woman who had no money, when money was the only thing standing between someone she loved and the worst that could happen. That was the private grief she had carried into every kitchen she'd ever worked in, the one she never told, the one that made her build springhouses and count coins twice and refuse, absolutely refuse, to let herself be a burden that might one day be too heavy for someone else to carry when it mattered most. She did not cry. She never cried where anyone could see it, but she stood a long moment with the paddle still, in the cold and the dark and the good clean smell of new butter, and let herself feel the whole weight of it before she wiped her face dry with the back of her wrist and carried the butter up to the house. The ranch, over those same weeks, had begun, in small and stubborn ways, to change shape around her. Ada, the silent 6-year-old, had taken to following Martha down to the Springhouse in the evenings and sitting on the stone step with a scrap of paper and a stub of pencil, drawing in fierce private concentration, and would not show anyone what she drew, not even Ruth, until one evening she simply held the paper out to Martha without a word. The way a person hands over something too fragile to accompany with speech. It was a drawing of a woman at a churn, done in a child's rough, urgent lines, and beside the woman, unmistakably, another woman, taller, thinner, her hand resting on the first woman's shoulder. "Is that your mother?" Martha asked very carefully, very quietly, and Ada nodded once, and then, in a voice so rusty from disuse that it cracked in the middle, said the first full sentence Martha had ever heard her speak. She smelled like clover and cream. And then, as if the sentence had cost her everything she had, Ada put her face against Martha's apron and did not say anything else. And Martha held her there in the last of the evening light and did not tell her to stop, did not tell her it was all right, only held her, because some griefs do not need managing, only witnessing. Jem, the baby, had slowly, over the same weeks, stopped crying quite so much, and Martha noticed it the way she noticed everything, in the accumulation of small evidence rather than any single dramatic proof. He slept through more nights. He reached for her now as readily as he reached for Ruth. And one evening, rocking him by the kitchen fire while a storm came up hard and sudden outside, rattling the shutters, she felt him go heavy and easy in her arms, in a way that told her, more than any words could have, that the house itself had begun in its bones. To feel less like a held breath and more like a place a small child could trust to still be standing in the morning. Ruth was the hardest door to open, because Ruth had built her own version of Martha's rule. Never ask for help, never show the strain, always be the one holding the roof up, and Martha recognized it because it was her own rule, wearing a smaller coat, and she knew that a rule like that could not be argued out of a person, only slowly, patiently, made unnecessary. She did this by never asking Ruth to stop managing, only by quietly managing more herself, until one evening Ruth came into the kitchen to find the mending done, the bread already proofing, the children already fed, and she stood in the doorway with an expression Martha had not seen on her before, not suspicion this time, not relief exactly either, but something like grief, finally being allowed to surface now that there was room for it. "I don't know how to not do everything," Ruth said in a small voice, sitting down hard at the table like her legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold her up. "If I stop, who's going to?" "I am," Martha said. "That's what I'm here for, not just the 18 men. You too. You've been the mother of this house for 2 years, and you were 12 years old when you started, and nobody ever told you that you were allowed to put it down." She sat across from the girl and did not reach for her, because Ruth was not a child who wanted to be handled, only heard. "You can be angry that nobody noticed. You're allowed that." Ruth's face did something complicated, fighting itself, and then, finally, broke, and she cried the way a person cries when they have been holding a great weight for a long time and someone else has finally, without asking, taken half of it, not delicately, not prettily but hard, and Martha sat with her through all of it, saying nothing, because she understood better than most that there is a kind of comfort that only works if it doesn't try to fix anything, only stays. It was 2 nights later on the porch, after the children were down, that Silas Doyle found Martha sitting with a lamp doing the household accounts she had quietly taken over, because someone had to, and Ruth could not go on being the one. And he stood in the doorway a long moment before he spoke. "Ruth told me what you said to her," he said, "about being allowed to put it down." Martha did not look up from the ledger, because she suspected he needed her not looking at him in order to get the next words out. It needed saying. "I hope I didn't overstep. You didn't." A silence then. "I've been letting that girl run this house since Eleanor died. Because I didn't." He stopped. Martha waited, the way she had learned to wait, without filling the silence for him. "I didn't have anything left over," he finished finally. The sentence completed for once, and it seemed to cost him everything he had to say it. "I keep thinking if I just get through the next season, the next debt, the next everything, there'll be something left over for the grieving. There never is a next season, though. There's just this one, and then another one behind it." "Grief doesn't wait for a good time," Martha said. "It just takes what time you give it, whether you mean to give it or not. You've been giving it all of yours without noticing, which is why there's nothing left for the children. Not because you don't love them enough, but because the grief's already spending everything you've got before you wake up in the morning." He was quiet a long time. "You talk like a woman who's buried someone." "I have," Martha said. "My mother. Money would have saved her, and there wasn't any, and I built my whole life since then around making sure that particular kind of helpless never happens to me again, or to anyone I can help it not happening to." She closed the ledger. "That's why the Springhouse mattered so much to me. It's not only butter and cheese, it's the only kind of fighting back I know how to do." Silas looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight, and something in his stillness shifted, not dramatically, not with any grand gesture, but the way a stone shifts half an inch when water has finally worn enough of it away. "I don't say the middle part of things," he said. "I know I don't. Eleanor used to tease me about it, said I'd start a sentence and just leave the important half hanging in the air like I expected her to catch it without me throwing it." He almost smiled. "She usually did catch it. I've noticed you do it," Martha said gently, because this felt like a door being opened a half inch, and she did not want to shove it the rest of the way. "You don't have to finish it tonight." He stopped predictably, and then, visibly forcing himself past the place he always stopped, he said, low and rough, "I'm glad you're here. That's the part I usually leave hanging." It was not a large sentence. It would not have impressed anyone listening from outside the particular silence the two of them had built over these last weeks. But Martha felt it land the way she imagined the men down at the corral must have felt a good rainland after a long drought, and she said simply, "I'm glad too," and let the moment be exactly as small and exactly as large as it was, without dressing it up into more than it could carry yet. The winter that followed was hard in the ordinary way that winters on a working cattle ranch are always hard, but the household inside it had begun to knit itself into something sturdier than it had been, and a Springhouse through the cold months became Martha's proving ground in earnest. She learned the rhythms of the 2 cows, then the 3rd she bought in December, learned which days the cream would rise thick and which days it would sulk, learned to press cheese in cloth-wrap rounds and store them on the cool stone shelves. She'd had coal and 2 of the more willing hands built into the Springhouse wall. Learned to time her butter so that a wagon could carry it into Concordia still firm on the coldest mornings and get the best price at the mercantile before the day warmed. By February, she was selling butter and soft cheese not only to the mercantile but to the small hotel at the edge of town, and to 2 other ranching families who had heard through the particular fast telegraph of rural gossip that the bar and cross cook made a butter sweeter than anything else for 40 miles, Mrs. Stant. Adelaide Purcell heard this too, and did not like it because a woman who had spent years positioning herself as the arbiter of who deserved respect in Concordia did not appreciate watching respect accumulate, unbidden, around a woman she had already decided did not merit it. She began subtly at first, and then less subtly, to suggest at her charity circle meetings that it was curious, wasn't it? How quickly the new cook at the Bar and Cross had made herself indispensable, how a woman without family or reference set down roots so fast in another man's household. It was the particular cruelty of respectable gossip, dressed always as concern, delivered always with a look of regret rather than malice, and it moved through Concordia the way such things move slow and thorough as damp through a wall. It reached its crisis at the spring social, held at the Concordia Church Hall in April, an event the whole territory turned out for, and Silas Doyle brought his family, Martha included, because by then there was no pretending she was merely staff, not to anyone who had watched Jem reach for her before he reached for his own father. Not to anyone who had seen Ada finally begin to speak in full sentences again. Not to anyone with eyes. Mrs. Purcell had clearly been waiting for precisely this stage, this audience, and she found her moment during the refreshment hour, raising her voice just enough to be heard by the room while appearing to address only Martha directly. "I do hope, Miss Kessler," she said, "that you understand the position you've put that family in. A cook who oversteps into being something more. People do talk. And I'd hate for those children to suffer for choices that aren't rightly theirs to answer for." The room had gone quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when it senses a public reckoning is about to happen and does not want to miss it. Martha felt every old instinct rise in her at once, make herself smaller, apologize for the space, give the credit away before anyone could take it from her by force, and she felt, standing beside her, Ruth go rigid with the old fury of a child who has learned that grown-ups' cruelty toward the people she loves is a thing she has no power to stop. And Cole's jaw setting the way it used to before Martha had given him a place to put his anger down. It was, unexpectedly, the housekeeper from the Purcell house itself, a quiet older woman named Bertha Lindqvist, who had worked for Adelaide Purcell for 9 years and had never once, in living memory, contradicted her employer in public, who spoke first. "Forgive me, Mrs. Purcell," Bertha said, and her voice, though soft, carried in the sudden hush the way a struck bell carries. "But I've eaten at your table for 9 years, and I've eaten twice now at the Doyle table since Miss Kessler came, and I'll tell you plainly what I saw there that I don't see at yours. I saw a girl of 12 laughing at supper instead of counting plates with a face like an old woman. I saw a boy who used to flinch when anyone raised a voice, sitting easy, high. I saw a child who hadn't spoken a full sentence in 2 years tell a joke at the table that made her father put his head down and laugh so hard he had to wipe his eyes. That's not a woman who's overstepped her place, Mrs. Purcell. That's a woman who found a family drowning and pulled every one of them up by main force, and did it without once asking for thanks. I'd think a woman as concerned with Christian charity as yourself would recognize that when she saw it, instead of standing here trying to make it smaller." The silence that followed had a different texture than the one before it, not anticipatory now, but reckoning, the whole room recalculating in real time, and Martha watched color rise in Adelaide Purcell's face, watched her open her mouth to recover some version of her authority and find, for the first time perhaps in years, that the room was not going to hand it back to her. Automatically. Silas Doyle stepped forward then, and Martha felt her breath catch, because she had never once seen him speak in front of a crowd, had barely heard him finish a full sentence in private, and she braced for him to stop, the way he always stopped, right at the place where it mattered most. "Mrs. Purcell," he said, and his voice, though quiet, filled the hall the way quiet voices do when everyone has gone still to hear them. "I buried my wife 2 years ago, and I did not know, until this winter, how much of my children I had also let slip away in the grieving. I hired Martha Kessler to feed 18 men, and what she did instead was feed a family that was starving in ways I couldn't see because I was too busy drowning in the same water. I don't much care what people say about the shape of that arrangement. I care that my son laughs again. I care that my daughter drew a picture of her mother for the first time since we'd buried her and handed it to someone without being afraid. I care that my oldest girl gets to be 12 years old again instead of 40. If that costs me the good opinion of this town, I find I can live without it a good deal easier than I lived without those things." He did not stop this time, in the middle. He said the whole sentence, all the way to its most vulnerable end, in front of the entire hall, and Martha, standing beside him, felt something in her chest crack open in a way that had nothing to do with the old grief, and everything to do with a new and unfamiliar kind of hope, the kind she had never let herself keep in the house for long, for fear it would cost too much when it inevitably left. Adelaide Purcell did not have an answer for that. She gathered what remained of her dignity, made some brief, stiff remark about the lateness of the hour, and left the hall considerably before the refreshments were finished, and the territory, in the way of small places, remembered that departure for a long time afterward as the evening Adelaide Purcell was finally handed back a portion of the judgment she'd spent years handing out. The second trouble, the one with real teeth, came to its own crisis not long after, when Everett Cray rode out to the bar and cross in early May with the particular grim punctuality of a man who has been waiting for a deadline to arrive so he can finally collect on it. Martha had known this day was coming since Ruth's whispered confession months before, and she had spent every one of those months building toward it in the only way she knew how, with butter and cheese and the long, unglamorous arithmetic of a small dairy operation grown steadily, quietly, into something real. She had, by that May, 3 cows in milk, a 4th heavy with calf, a standing order with the Concordia Mercantile, the hotel, and now a general store, 2 towns over, that had heard of her reputation and sent a rider specifically to ask for a standing supply, and a small, carefully hoarded strongbox of coin that she had never once mentioned to Silas Doyle, because she had wanted more than anything to be certain the number in it was real before she let anyone else start counting on it. She came into the kitchen the morning Cray arrived, and found Silas already at the table with the man and his folder of papers. The same grim posture as before, hands flat on the wood. And she set down a cup of coffee she had not been asked for, and said, in a voice that did not shake because she had trained it over years not to, "Cray, before you and Mr. Doyle finish your business, I'd like to add something to the ledger, if you'll permit it." Cray looked at her with the mild, dismissive courtesy men in his position generally extended to women who interrupted business, the courtesy of someone who expects to be humored for a moment and then to proceed exactly as planned. "This is a matter between myself and Mr. Doyle, miss." "It's a matter of what's owed and what can be paid against it," Martha said. "And I've got 4 months of dairy receipts here that say some of what's owed can be paid today. In coin, not promises." She set the strongbox on the table and opened it, and watched both men look down into it. Silas with an expression of pure astonishment he did not manage to hide. Cray with the sharper, more careful look of a man recalculating a figure he had assumed was fixed. "This is—" Silas started, and, for once, in front of a stranger, finished the sentence without letting it hang. "This is more than I make in a season off the herd alone. Some years. It's 4 months of a dairy operation that didn't exist 5 months ago," Martha said. "Built out of a ruined springhouse nobody thought was worth fixing, and it'll be more next season, because the operation's only getting bigger, and the market for good butter in this territory isn't going anywhere. I'd ask, Mr. Cray, that you look at this not as a curiosity, but as evidence. Evidence that this ranch has more ways to pay what it owes than the herd alone, and evidence that betting against this family right now would be betting against a debt that's actively shrinking, rather than one sitting still waiting to be foreclosed on." Cray studied the coin for a long moment, and then studied Martha for a longer one with the particular attention of a man whose whole professional instinct was built around correctly judging whether a risk was actually a risk or merely looked like one. "2. You built this," he said. It was not quite a question. "I did, with my own hands, and Mr. Doyle's permission and his son's help hauling stone." She held his gaze. "I've got no reason to lie to a banker about arithmetic. The numbers are the numbers. You can verify every receipt in that box against the mercantile's own books if you doubt me." There was a long silence, the kind Martha had come to recognize as the particular silence of a decision being weighed rather than avoided. And finally, Cray closed the folder he had brought with him, not putting it away entirely, but setting it down in a way that suggested its contents were for the moment no longer the only relevant document on the table. "I'll extend the note another season," he said slowly, as if testing the words for soundness even as he spoke them, "on the condition that this dairy operation is accounted for properly in future, as an asset of the ranch, and that I see quarterly receipts going forward. I foreclosed on ranches before, Mr. Doyle, and I'll tell you plainly, it's never been my preference. A foreclosed ranch is worth less to my bank than a solvent one, and I'd rather have my note paid in full over time than own a piece of land I've got no use for and no buyer waiting. This," he gestured at the strongbox, "is the first evidence I've seen in 2 years that this note might actually get paid rather than merely apologize for." Silas Doyle sat very still for a moment, the particular stillness of a man absorbing the sudden lifting of a weight he had been braced against for so long he'd forgotten what his shoulders felt like without it. And then he looked at Martha with an expression she had not yet seen on him, not gratitude exactly, but something closer to wonder, the look of a man realizing the ground under him was not after all going to give way. When Cray had ridden out, folder tucked back under his arm, but note extended. Contract to be drawn up formally within the week, Silas sat at the table a long moment before he spoke, and when he did, his voice had a rough edge to it that Martha had never heard before. "You've been building that," he said, "this whole time, and you never told me." "I didn't want to promise you a rescue and then hand you a disappointment," Martha said. "I wanted to hand you a fact." "You handed me my whole ranch back," he said, and this time he did not stop in the middle of the sentence. He said all of it, plain and complete, the way he had at the church hall. I don't know how a man says thank you for a thing that size. You don't have to find the words for it, Martha said. You already gave me the Springhouse. That was the whole of what I needed. It wasn't nothing what you did with it, though, he said, and stood and crossed the kitchen to where she stood by the stove, closer than he had ever stood to her before, close enough that she had to tip her head back a little to meet his eyes, and he said, with the particular clumsy courage of a man saying an unpracticed thing for the first time in years, I've been meaning to say the middle part of a sentence to you for a while now, and I keep losing my nerve at the edge of it. You don't have to lose your nerve on my account, Martha said, and her voice was not quite steady for once, and she found she did not mind that it wasn't. I love you, Silas Doyle said, plain. No ornament on it at all, exactly the kind of unhedged declarative sentence Martha herself favored. And then, because apparently once the dam broke there was no half measure left in him, he kept going. I loved my wife with everything I had, and I thought when she died that was the whole of the love I had in me, spent and done, and I've spent 2 years believing that, and building a life around the belief like it was a wall holding something back. Then you came off that stage counting coins, like you were already planning 6 things at once, and inside of a season you gave my children back to me, and gave me back to my children, and I don't know how to call that anything but love, however late it arrived, or however little sense it makes for a man to say it to his cook 3 months after hiring her to feed 18 hands. I stopped being only your cook a while back, Martha said. I think we both know that. I think everyone at the church hall knew that before either of us said it out loud. Stay then, he said. Not as staff. Stay because I'm asking you to, plainly, with no hedging in it. This is home, Martha. You built half of it yourself, out of stone nobody else thought was worth saving. I'd like you to stay in it as more than the woman who saved it. I keep my promises, Martha said, which was the closest thing she had to a vow, the way she'd built the sentence over years of watching other people's promises fail. And I'm promising you now, in front of nobody but this kitchen, that I'm not going anywhere. And Silas Doyle, a man who had spent 2 years unable to finish his own sentences, closed the last half-inch of distance between them and kissed her without leaving a single word of it hanging. And, outside the kitchen window, unnoticed by either of them for a long moment, 4 children stood pressed together at the porch rail. Ruth with her arms around Ada, Cole grinning for once with nothing angry behind it. Jem on Ruth's hip reaching one small fist toward the window, as if he too understood, in whatever way a 14-month-old understands anything, that something in the house had just finished healing. They married in June, in the same church hall where Adelaide Purcell had tried and failed to shrink Martha down to a size she found comfortable, and the whole territory came, including, notably, Adelaide Purcell herself, who arrived with a basket of preserves and a stiff, unpracticed apology that Martha accepted with the same plain grace she accepted everything, because holding a grudge was not on the list either, not when there was a whole life to build instead. Bertha Lindfist stood near the front and cried through the whole ceremony, unashamed, and told anyone who asked that she'd never once regretted a word she'd said at the spring social, not even the ones that had cost her, briefly, her position, which Silas Doyle had in fact offered to remedy by hiring her outright to help with the growing dairy operation. An offer she'd accepted before he'd finished the sentence. The Springhouse, by the following spring, had become something the whole county spoke of. A small stone building with a spring running clean and cold through its center, shelves lined with rounds of pale cheese and crocks of butter that fetched the best price in 3 counties, staffed now by Martha and Bertha together, and on weekends by Cole, who had developed, to everyone's surprise but Martha's, a genuine talent for the patient, exacting work of cheese-making, and who told anyone who asked that he liked it because it was work you could be angry at and it never once got angry back. It just asked you to be patient, and patience, it turned out, was a thing grief could be taught if you gave it the right kind of task. Ada spoke more and more as that first year turned, though she never became a chatterer, never lost the quality of choosing her words with the care of someone who understood, better than most children her age, that words carried weight and ought not be spent carelessly, and she kept drawing, always, though the pictures grew steadily less private, until by the following spring she had a whole wall in the Springhouse covered in her drawings of cows and butter churns, and at the center of them all, unmistakably, 2 women standing side by side at a churn, one drawn from memory and one drawn from life, and beneath them, in a child's careful laboring letters, the words, "She stayed." Ruth, freed at last from the weight she had carried since she was 10 years old, discovered, with something like astonishment, that she was allowed simply to be a girl of 13 and then 14, with time for school books and for friendships in town, and for the particular ordinary luxury of being annoyed at her little brother without also being solely responsible for managing him. And she told Martha once, on the porch on a summer evening much like the one where Martha had first heard the family's troubles whispered to her in the dark, that she had spent 2 years believing that if she ever once stopped holding the house up, it would fall down entirely, and that the strangest gift Martha had ever given her was proving that it wouldn't, that there had been someone else strong enough to hold it, and that she, Ruth, had simply never been given the chance to find that out until Martha arrived and took the weight without being asked. Jem grew as babies do, out of the crying that had once seemed like it might never end, into a solid, sunny toddler who followed Martha everywhere. He was permitted calling her by a garbled toddler's version of her name that eventually the whole family adopted as an affectionate nickname, and who, on the day of his 2nd birthday, walked the whole length of the Springhouse path on his own 2 feet for the first time, unassisted, straight into Martha's waiting arms, as if his whole small body understood, before his mind had the words for it, exactly where safety lived in that house. Silas Doyle finished his sentences. Not every one, not all at once, not in some sudden and complete transformation that would have strained belief, but more of them, season by season, the way a man's grief properly witnessed and properly shared slowly stops requiring quite so much silence to carry it. And Martha learned, over the years that followed, precisely which of his silences were peaceful and which were the old kind, the kind that still needed a hand set gently on his arm and a patient wait for whatever half-sentence he could manage that day. And she gave him that patience the same way she gave everyone in that house the particular, unglamorous gift of simply staying, day after day, without asking anything in return but the same in kind. The old-timers in Concordia, in the years that followed, would tell the story of the bar and cross to anyone new enough in the territory not to have heard it. The story of the big cook who came off the stage with $16 and a burned reference, and turned a drowned ruin of a Springhouse into the finest dairy operation in 3 counties. The story of the widower who learned to finish his sentences, and the 4 children who learned one by one, in their own time and their own way, that a house that had once sounded like a held breath could, with patience and with the right person's hands in it, learn to breathe out again. They would tell it at church socials and at the counter of the mercantile and on porches in the long gold evenings of late summer, and they would always end it the same way, the way stories in that territory tended to end, with the same plain moral offered up like a coin passed hand to hand. That home was never the house itself, however fine or however ruined, but the people willing to stay inside it and do the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding it, stone by stone, spring by spring, sentence by unfinished sentence, until what had once been broken became against every expectation the world had held for it, the very thing that held everyone else up.